I bow before the great, and I don't use that word idly, Jim Lauderdale. Jim, I just have to start off by saying, how much I respect you. I think you know that as a songwriter,
Oh,
as a
likewise.
recording artist, you have just navigated every challenge that ever presented itself to you in this industry. And as an entertainer, I've seen you a lot, and I've never seen you a single time that I didn't feel like I got my money's worth and then some. Y'all welcome the
Well,
great Jim Lauderdale this morning.
thanks so much, Bart. It's great to be here.
And by the way, we'll throw a shout out to our friend Jed Hilly that runs the Americana Music
Yes.
Association. That you two, your role in that, Americana as a genre got lifted, and you get a lot of that credit, Mr. Lauderdale. A lot of people
Well,
do, but I
thank you.
just want to say all that because I can.
Well, thank you. I sure appreciate them and all they're doing.
So we're going to kind of double up today. King of Broken Hearts and Where the Sidewalk Ends both appear on what I think is the seminal love story movie ever in the history of the country music genre. And I didn't know this, Jim. I remembered this when I went back to do a little research that you had already released The King of Broken Hearts. Did you release previously also Where the Sidewalk Ends, or?
I did. I'll tell you what happened. I that came out on a record that on Reprise,
Right,
and Rodney Crowell and John Leventhal, who John and I co-wrote, I think 8 out of the 10 songs on that record.
right.
Super talented, and so those came out, and the record got delayed and all this stuff. It finally came out, and we had real high hopes for it, but it radio wise for me, it just didn't, it just wasn't happening. But and as a songwriter, I had been commuting back and forth from Los Angeles. I grew up in North Carolina, South
Right.
Carolina, ended up in New York, Los Angeles. I had come to Nashville for about 5 months after I got out of college, and I couldn't uh, get it going, things
Right, right.
enough. So I ended up in these other places, ended up in Los Angeles where there was a real cool country scene going on. And I was afraid to come back to Nashville thinking if it doesn't start happening, it would just crush me and I
Yeah,
don't have anything to fall back on.
yeah.
So anyhow, I was out there in Los Angeles, did this record, and it was out, but with little fanfare. So what happened was that I got a call. I had signed a publishing deal, which was probably the best thing I had ever done, with independent publisher Brownlee Ferguson, with
Hmm.
his company called Blue Water
Oh,
Music.
yeah.
And so I got a call from Pat
And by the
McMurray.
way, I don't think it's coincidental what happened with that company in the years after you signed over there. They exploded in this
Oh
town.
yeah, they just did great. Also, too, I want to give a shout out. I did get one of my first cuts with a great country singer from the West Coast named Jan Brown. Had cut Where the Sidewalk
Right,
Ends,
right. I'd
and
forgotten that. Yeah.
and so I got a call from Pat McMurray, who had been plugging my songs over there at Blue Water, and I I think at that time, up till then, a lot of producers and folks in town were thinking, his stuff, it's a little bit too left of center. It's not quite what we're looking for. So,
And by the
Pat
way,
McMurray,
not to interrupt again, but this string of hits you were about to have, I think they infected the whole genre. You opened the door for left of center in a most
well,
glorious way, Jim, but you did,
well,
man.
thank you,
So,
Bart. Thank you. Well, Pat called me and said yesterday, Tony Brown recorded Where the Sidewalk Ends and King of Broken Hearts for George Strait, and it's going to be in a movie. And I just couldn't believe it.
there's no
Things
producer, no artist at the time. That's the most coveted cut you can get at that time.
that was just, and so that really opened up the door for
Yeah.
me as a writer. I continued to uh, make records, and I tried again with RCA on my own with Atlantic, then RCA and things, and I really appreciate those folks taking
Well,
a
I met
chance
you
on
through
me.
Renee Bell. I remember what a champion she was, man, of
Oh, she was
yours.
so
Yeah.
is so great. Yeah, such a wonderful woman. And they tried too at RCA to get things going for me at radio, but um, I learned uh, that really, if you're not going to be a hit radio artist on your own at a label, there's really, that's kind of one of the main
Yeah.
functions of a major label is to that's the way they can survive and sustain themselves. They need those artists. And there's so many really terrific writers and singers who, we were all trying for the
Yeah.
country radio play, but I was always disappointed as an artist. It's like, darn it, that
Yeah.
didn't happen for me. But I kept getting these cuts, and it was that softened the blow of not having things on my own on the radio, and it also allowed me to start doing independent
Yeah.
records on my own.
Well, and
And
look what you did, man. I mean, has there been a more, I don't care about any independent artist I've known in the last 20 years to the level I do what you produce, Jim Lauderdale. I mean,
thank you.
I think everybody should know this. The industry, there's a small handful of people like the new Lauderdale records coming out,
Oh,
which we're going to talk about in a second. However, let's
sure.
back up for a minute. I originally asked you, and I remembered all this, that you had recorded these songs. And when I remembered that all, and you had told me that years ago, I was surprised. And I'm going to tell you why. You couldn't have written something for George Strait and for that movie so scene specific. Looking back on it, did that even surprised you how they transposed? I mean, you couldn't have written one for the movie better for the scenes those songs are in, and they're in
That
more than one. So
I was so happy about that. And and I'll tell you, I do want to give a big shout out to the man that I was mentioning, John Leventhal,
mhm,
and Rodney Crowell, for Rodney taking that chance
yeah,
and coming in and doing so great. And then John and I'd gotten a call from him when I was in Los Angeles living there. And he said he was living in New York, and that's where I met him. And I started using John he was a great guitar player back then. And he started coming in and doing demos with me in New York. I was spending every dime I had and going back to New York. And a fellow named Steve Satterwhite kindly gave me free studio time. And there are a lot of great country musicians up in New York. And John was one of them, just incredible guitar player. So I started when he was coming in the studio, he had great ideas. And then he called one day and said, I'm coming out to LA. Would you like to try to write a song? And I said, well, sure. And I hadn't really been co-writing up to
mhm,
this point. And so we got together and talked for a while. And he said, I've got this title I just want to throw out at you, Where the Sidewalk Ends. And so he said that, and I musically it came to me, where the sidewalk ends and the road begins. And then he said, we said goodbye on a cold dark night. And it went back and forth. And then he went back to New York, and I get this cassette in the mail. That's how we did it back
yeah,
then. We're sending cassettes, and it was this great demo with this different groove on the first part, and it was it was awesome. And that demo was where things went for us to do the version we did with Rodney in the studio, and what Chad Brown did, and what Tony Brown heard from our finished product in the studio. And he is just a brilliant uh, writer, producer, guitar player, and wonderful guy. And so I'm so grateful to John and to Rodney and Tony
Yeah.
Brown and George Strait. And yeah, George Strait just, he really nailed it.
Well,
And
let
I
me
still
brag
can't
on
believe it.
you
Sure.
for a minute. I had not heard the demo, and I don't really remember. I think I heard Jan's version of it back in the day, but I did hear King of Broken Hearts. And I got to give Mr. Strait, I'm going to give you, first of all, the ultimate compliment I can ever give anybody. There's two simultaneously. That had to be personal, Jim. I mean, that's you and the song, because I feel so much when I hear it. I feel you emoting, having lived every dang line of that song. Am I right?
I guess so. And I'll tell you the story behind that. When I was I had been in Los Angeles about 3 or 4 months, and one of the reasons I went out there was because I was so uh, enamored by this artist named Graham Parsons.
Yeah.
And Graham had been gone about 15 years, and he did 2 solo albums with Emmy Lou, and before that he was with the International Submarine Band and the Byrds and the Flying Burrito
Hmm.
Brothers. But there was this real uh, magic about Graham and just such feeling. And so I was reading, and George Jones was like my guy as far as a singer. And I just was so crazy about George. And so I'd listened to both of them so much, and they just, and I mean, and you know how it is with music. You know, when it moves you, it really moves
Yeah.
you, certain folks. So I was reading this biography of Graham written by this fellow from a group called the Long Riders, and his name was Sid Griffin. And there was a story, and I was living in this place called the Magic Hotel in Hollywood. And uh, an interesting side note, there was a real quiet, very shy guy working at the desk. And I'd come in and we'd talk, and and I'd come in and out, and I'd have my guitar with me, and we'd chat for a while. And years later, I ran into him at a diner in LA, and I hadn't seen him in a while. And I went up and said, "How are you doing? What have you been up to?" And they said, "Well, I've been traveling, doing my music." And I said, "Music? I didn't realize you did music." And he kind of chuckled a little bit, said, "Yeah, yeah." And so I was like, "Oh man, great to see you. Good luck." And so about a week later, I was looking through Rolling Stone magazine, and there was an ad, and it was like, "That's him." And it was Jeff Buckley,
Hmm.
who went on to have this
Well,
great,
Hallelujah and a million others,
yeah. And
Yeah.
before he tragically
Yeah.
passed away.
Wow.
But I was sitting there in the Magic Hotel
Wow.
reading, pouring over this book about Graham Parsons. And there was a story about how Graham had a party in Hollywood, and he was playing George Jones's records for people who hadn't heard him. And he started crying, and he said, "That's the king of broken hearts." And
Oh
that
man, I'm getting the
started
chill bumps,
that
Jim Lauderdale.
started
Oh
that
my
thing.
God.
And so all of a sudden I got this melody, "The king of broken hearts doesn't ask much from his friend." And then it went on. And so it was one of those uh, things that I tell songwriters, keep your songwriting antenna up,
Yeah.
because you never know when you're going to read something or somebody's going to say something that triggers this whole song. And then I drove out um, later to the Joshua Tree National Monument, which is a place I started going to write. And at that time, it was very quiet, and I would go out there. Especially, I loved full moons, because you could be out there
Hmm.
in the middle of this place, and it looked like you were on the moon, a landscape or Mars or something, and you wouldn't be able to hear anything. And so
But
I
there's so
finished.
much life in that stillness too, you know?
Oh yeah, exactly,
I mean, it's
absolutely,
like,
yeah, yeah. And so it was a full moon, and I went to this place called Cap Rock and finished the song. And so yeah, that one that's a tune that just about every show I've done since then, maybe a show or two, I haven't. I'd always do that song, and
your
yeah, it really
version
means a lot
slays
to
me,
me.
man. So,
Well,
and
thank
I'm
you.
going to say, we'll move on. 'Cause a couple of other things I want to get to, but I got to say,
Sure.
I give George all the credit in the world for staying so true to your arrangement of it, man.
Well,
Because you could have, you know, he should have done what he did, and everybody was successful because of it. Because you nailed it on the first pass, Jim. Just saying. So,
well, thank you, and also too, I was so um, fortunate that Emmylou Harris agreed to come in and
mhm.
put her magical angelic harmony on there, and that, boy, that just meant the world to me.
Well, but a lump, that would have been a game changer, which is the title of your new record. I couldn't resist. Yeah. But tell us about the new record that's just out recently.
This record, Game Changer, is, well, about, I guess, about 3 years ago, or maybe a little longer. I got the riff of a song called, and I ended up calling it That Kind of Life, That Kind of Day, but a pedal steel and Telecaster riff that was in that I love. One thing that I really appreciated about the Graham Parsons albums was how James Burton and Al Perkins would do these twin harmony parts, and that really stuck with me. And I put that kind of thing and Halfway Down and some other things, and I just thought that was so great. So this riff came to me, and I had been recording a fair amount at Blackbird Studios, which they have a school called the Blackbird Academy.
Right.
And uh, Jay Weaver, a great bass player who ended up becoming my co-producer on all this stuff, um, we would assemble this great team, and for that song, we had Kenny Vaughan on guitar,
Man.
and Chris
And if people
Scruggs was.
don't know, you'll hear it when you'll know when you hear it.
Yes, yes, and let's see, Will Van Horn and Pat Bubert's on drums on that. Micah Hulsher plays with Margot Price on piano, and so I we cut that song, and then went on from there, and I was real excited and thinking, okay, the first song is done, the second song, the third song, as this went on, and I was hearing a sound and kind of a concept for, like, I want to, in a cyclically, I kind of will go from a straight ahead country record to a pushing the envelope
Mhm.
country record to a bluegrass thing, and a bluesy, soul thing in Memphis or whatever. And I thought, it's time for me. I'm really getting this pull to go back and do something that is unmistakably country.
Good for
And
you. You know, we all want to hear that,
well,
right? I'm just saying.
I love doing that.
Yeah.
And the title song, Game Changer, um, there's a fellow that plays with me a lot, Craig Smith, who also um, plays with Susie Boggess a lot. So I'm lucky when I can get Craig on the road or in the studio. And also on the record throughout is Lily Mae Rishi and her brother Frank Rishi, who are so talented. and we're actually in the studio right now. I'm doing a side project with them, as a vocal group, acoustic vocal group, and I just love them. And so and so I was real jazzed about this record. And then when the pandemic came, I thought, and like everybody, it threw
Yeah.
me for such a loop, and I didn't even play for, I didn't want to practice. I was just in such a funk. And then eventually some songs started coming to me. I thought, if there's one thing I can do is to write some hopeful songs for folks during this time. So I did that, and that record's called Hope. And but then as that went on, I started getting calls from Blackbird Academy saying you want to come in. So I was of a mind to, well, I've got this record, and I think it's getting time to finish that. And I started adding to it, and saving some other songs and adding to it. So it finally got done, and so it'll be, yeah, so it's out now, and real happy about it, and looking forward to touring behind it and stuff too.
Well, JimLauderdaleMusic.com. You can find all the records. You can find the tour dates. And final question, Jim. There's no, of course, it's Strait. It's in the heyday. It's a heck of a script. I don't think, and George has said this over and over, nobody knew the shelf life of that movie. Heck, it's bigger today than it was when it came out. Did you have any ink? You couldn't have known.
No way. No, I had no idea. And the interesting thing is, I think, we try to do different things conceptually or with some kind of a strategy sometimes, of like, well, I want this to happen and that happen, and if I do this, then it's logical that this would be the result of that. And so I've planned certain things that have not ever come to fruition, but that was something I couldn't have planned any better, or hoped for, or
Yeah.
wished for. And it just, yeah, that movie just took on a life of its own. And hey, I'm still gonna be pitching. I hope George Strait's gonna be going back in. I had a cut on
Right.
his last record with my friend Odie Blackman,
Right.
and so I've got a batch of songs I'm gonna be pitching for him for the next one. I'm just, he and Patty Loveless and some others have really, that's what has allowed me to have a living.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're all richer for it. The King of Broken Hearts, where the sidewalk ends. Part of the Pure Country soundtrack. Let's remember JimLauderdaleMusic.com. Those are the songs, a sort of a dual episode this week for the Tennessean and Tennessean.com story behind the song.